Long before Israel existed, before there were kings, prophets, or commandments, even before there was a people, there was only one man, alone, in the middle of the silence, surrounded by pagan temples, stone gods. A man hears a voice that did not come from idols. It didn't come from tradition. It came from above. And that voice said, "Leave your country and go where I will show you." He didn't know where he was going, but he obeyed. And it was in this leap of faith that a story was born. The story of the only nation God calls my inheritance. Today you'll discover how it all began and why this promise still transforms the world 4,000 years later. It all begins with a call, done not for a multitude, but for a single man. Abraham lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, an ancient city, advanced for its time, full of towers, astrology, and the worship of silent gods. There, amidst families, commerce, and tradition, he hears something unprecedented, the voice of the living God, a voice that calls him to leave everything and journey into the unknown. There was no guarantee. There was no map. There was only a promise. God tells him that he will make him a great nation, that his descendants will be countless, and that through him all the families of the earth will be blessed. A bold promise, made to an elderly man, without children, without land, without inheritance. And yet, he goes. This is the starting point. Israel was not born as an organized civilization. It was born as a faith. Before there were laws, kings, or territory, there was only this covenant between God and a man willing to believe. But this story isn't just about Abraham, because his journey prepares the way for Isaac, the promised son, born against all odds. And then for Jacob, the grandson, who wrestles with God, has his name transformed and carries within him the identity of an entire people. It is with him that the name Israel appears for the first time. Next come the 12 sons, and with them the formation of tribes, of a structure. They were not yet a kingdom. They did not yet have territory, but the people already existed, growing, multiplying, keeping a promise. In this video, we're going to walk through this entire line. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12. Let's understand how, 4,000 years ago, and the history of the only nation chosen directly by God began. A story marked by faith, conflict, miracles, but above all, it is marked by a promise that spans generations, and it continues to live on to this day. If something within you has been stirred by remembering God's faithfulness, so take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. There's much more content like this coming soon. And comment below where you're watching from. We want to know how long this promise continues to resonate, because even after 4,000 years, the call is still alive. Everything we know as Israel was born with a single step. It wasn't with armies, it wasn't with laws, it wasn't with stones piled up in Jerusalem. It began with a man, in the middle of a pagan city, hearing a voice that no one else could hear. Abram, that was his original name, lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, one of the most sophisticated regions of ancient Mesopotamia. Ur was a proud city, marked by towers, commerce, and astronomy. Its inhabitants worshipped many gods, especially Nannar, the moon god. Everything there revolved around celestial cycles and silent rituals. But it was there, where the gods did not speak, that the living God broke the silence. And he spoke to him. What happened next is a watershed moment in human history, because that voice offered neither comfort nor stability. It demanded something radical. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to a land I will show you. There was no map. There were no certainties, only an unseen direction and a bold promise. This promise included 3 pillars that would change everything. First, descendants. God promised to make him a great nation, even though he was a childless man and already advanced in age. Second, a piece of land, a physical inheritance where their lineage would live and prosper. And third, universal purpose. In you all the families of the earth will be blessed. This last part changes everything, because it wasn't just about one ethnic group. The blessing promised to Abraham would cross borders, centuries, empires, until it reached the whole world. And he believed, not because he had proof, nor because he understood the details, but because he trusted. And this faith was so decisive that, later, the Bible itself states, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. That's how he left Ur. He crossed strange lands. He passed through Canaan, arrived in Egypt, returned, all this without possessing anything of substance. The only thing he carried was the promise. Over time, God reaffirms the covenant. In Genesis 15, he commands Abraham to look up at the sky and count the stars. If he could, so shall your descendants be. But the years go by, and nothing happens. Sarah, his wife, remains barren, and the promise seems impossible. This is where a critical detail comes in. Faith is tested by time. Abraham tries to resolve the matter through his own means. Sarah offers her servant Hagar, and Ishmael is born from her. But God makes it clear that the promise will not be fulfilled through the flesh, but through a miracle. The heir will come from Sarah, even though it's improbable, even though it's biologically impossible. Time keeps passing, and at 99 years old, God speaks to him again, but this time he changes his name. From Abram, meaning exalted father, to Abraham, father of multitudes, not just the father of one people, but of many peoples. God also changed Sarai's name to Sarah, meaning princess, and she reaffirms, within a year, she will give birth to a son. What was being sealed there was more than a promise. It was an eternal covenant, and this alliance would be confirmed with a physical sign, circumcision. From that moment on, every male child was to be circumcised on the 8th day. As a mark of the covenant with God, it wasn't just a tradition, it was a visible declaration of belonging. Isaac's birth finally happens and marks the turning point. But the turning point in Abraham's faith was yet to come. Years later, when Isaac had grown up, God asked him to do something that seemed impossible to accept. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, and offer him as a burnt offering. The Bible does not recount any hesitation. Abraham obeys. He climbs Mount Moriah with Isaac. He takes firewood, fire, a knife, and silence. Isaac asks, "My father, where is the lamb?" And Abraham replied, "God will provide the lamb for himself." The tension in that scene is almost unbearable. But at the decisive moment, when the blade is about to fall, the angel of the Lord calls him by name and stops everything. The test is complete. Faith has been proven, and the promise is now unshakable. A ram caught by its horns appears among the bushes. Abraham sacrifices him in place of his son, and he gave that place a new name, YHWH-Jireh. The Lord will provide. The alliance scenario is now complete. Abraham believed. He obeyed. He waited. And for all these reasons, it becomes the starting point not only of the history of Israel, but of biblical faith as a whole. He is called the father of all who believe. His story marks the beginning of the relationship between God and a people who did not yet exist, and his personal journey becomes a model of faith, obedience, and hope for the centuries to come. Israel had not yet been born, but the seed had already been planted, and nothing could stop her anymore. God's silence is often longer than the human heart can bear, and it was in this silence that Abraham and Sarah lived for years, waiting for a promise that seemed further and further away. Sarah's body was aging. Logic said, impossible. Time said, too late. But the word of God does not depend on the human clock. At the exact right time, and not before, God spoke again. And what he said seemed even more improbable than before. In a year, Sarah will have a child. Sarah listened and laughed. Not out of mockery, but out of genuine disbelief. She laughed like someone who has learned not to be fooled. But God responded with a question that has endured through the centuries. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? And indeed, at the appointed time, Sarah conceived. And what was biologically improbable happened with divine naturalness. A boy was born, and his name was Isaac, which means he laughs. No longer the laughter of doubt, but the laughter of fulfilled joy. Isaac was not just another son. He was the only one through whom the promise would continue. And this becomes evident when God reaffirms, through Isaac, Your offspring will be reckoned. This detail is crucial because Ishmael already existed and was Abraham's biological son. But God makes it clear, spiritual lineage does not follow the logic of blood, but of promise. Ishmael would be blessed, but he would not bear the covenant. The covenant line passes through Isaac, the impossible son, born through divine intervention. He grows up among tents, learning faith from his parents. There aren't many stories about her childhood, but everything indicates that she lived under the constant gaze of a father marked by obedience and a mother marked by belated hope. But what comes next, once again, defies all human logic. Years after his birth, God asks Abraham for something that seems to contradict everything he had promised, to sacrifice one's own son. Isaac is now a teenager, strong enough to carry the firewood for the Holocaust, but young enough to trust in silence. They climb Mount Moriah together, just the two of them, and the tension of the moment grows with each step. Isaac breaks the silence with an innocent yet cutting question. "My father, we have the wood and the fire, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham's response is not merely theological, it is prophetic. God will provide the lamb for himself. At the top of the mountain, the altar is erected, the wood is placed, and Isaac is bound. The biblical text does not say that he resisted. Everything indicates that he trusted in his father and in the God of his father. Abraham raises the knife, and at that moment, the angel of the Lord calls him, interrupting everything. The test was complete. The faith was confirmed. God never wanted Isaac's blood. He wanted Abraham's heart. And I wanted to make it clear, the promise does not depend on human strength, but on radical obedience. At that moment, Abraham saw a ram caught by its horns, and the sacrifice is made. The altar receives blood, but not Isaac's blood. The place receives a new name, YHWH Jireh. The Lord will provide. This event profoundly marked Isaac's life. It wasn't just another moment with his father. It was a revelation of the God who fulfills his promises, but also tests. It promises much, but it also proves itself. After that episode, time passes. Sarah dies. Abraham grows old, and the time comes to find a wife for Isaac. But here we see another crucial point. Isaac does not go out to look for her. Abraham sends a servant, and this servant, after praying and trusting, finds Rebekah, a young woman who shows kindness, diligence, and courage. She agrees to leave with him immediately without knowing Isaac, trusting only in his word that there was a promise. The wedding takes place, and something rare is described in the Bible. Isaac loves Rebekah, a quiet yet profound love. But like Sarah, Rebekah also faces infertility, and once again, the continuation of the promise seems threatened. This time, Isaac prays, he intercedes, and he cries out, and God answers. Rebekah becomes pregnant, and she soon notices something strange. There's a conflict inside her womb. She seeks the Lord, and he answers, "2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples will be separated from you. One will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." What seemed like just a difficult pregnancy was, in fact, a harbinger of what was to come. Esau and Jacob were born there, twins, but with different destinations. Esau is born first, red and hairy, a hunter and impulsive. Jacob comes next, holding his brother's heel, and already bearing in his name the mark of one who fights for blessings. Isaac is now a father, but his role isn't over yet. He loves Esau. He prefers his strong nature, his hunting skills, his manly appearance. But the promise doesn't follow preferences. God had already determined that the youngest would receive the leading role. Isaac grows old. His vision dims, and without knowing it, she is about to bless the wrong child. But Jacob, with Rebekah's help, gets ahead of her, disguises himself, and receives the blessing. But one thing is clear. Even when human logic attempts to guide the course of history, God holds the thread of the promise in his hand. Isaac is not just a link between Abraham and Jacob. He is a living reminder that God fulfills impossible promises, and that everything that truly comes from above. If this part of the story is affecting you, if the birth of Isaac reminded you that God accomplishes the impossible, take advantage of this opportunity and subscribe to the channel, because there are still many promises to be fulfilled on this journey. The boy was born, holding his brother's heel. Even from the womb, Jacob carried within him a competitive spirit. He was the second twin, coming right after Esau. But while his brother was strong, a hunter, impulsive, Jacob grew up quiet, observant, attentive to detail. His name meant he who grasps the heel, but it also carried the idea of someone who takes another's place. This tension between the two brothers would become the backdrop for an entire generation. Isaac, the father, preferred Esau. Rebekah, the mother, loved Jacob. And what begins as a rivalry between sons transforms into a clash of destinies. The first turning point happens on an ordinary day. Esau, hungry after a hunt, finds Jacob preparing a stew. The smell fills the air, stomachs clench, and haste takes over. Jacob sees the opportunity, and he proposes a trade, food for birthright. Esau, without realizing the weight of what he was carrying, accepted, but the blessing was still missing. Later, when Isaac is already blind, he prepares to bless Esau. Rebekah listens, and she plots a risky plan with Jacob. He would disguise himself as his brother, deceive their father, and receive the blessing. Jacob hesitates, but Rebekah insists. The scene is fraught with tension, furs on arms, clothes smelling of the countryside, words spoken in a grave tone. Isaac finds the voice strange, but trusts the touch, and it releases the blessing that would continue the promise made to Abraham. There's no going back. When Esau finds out, his fury explodes. Jacob is forced to flee alone, leaving behind everything he knew. On the way, when the sun sets, he finds only a stone as a pillow, but that night, the sky opens up. He dreams of a ladder connecting earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending. And above, God. The promise is renewed. The alliance is reaffirmed. The land where he is will be his. His descendants will be numerous. And most importantly, God will be with him wherever he goes. Jacob wakes up astonished. He marks the place. He calls it Bethel, house of God. But there's still a long way to go. He goes to Haran, where he finds Rachel by the well. There, the narrative shifts in tone. Jacob falls in love. He works for her for 7 years, but he is deceived by his own uncle Laban and marries Leah first. The irony is clear. The deceiver is now being deceived. Years pass. Children are born. First to Leah, then to the servants, and finally to Rachel. And the home is marked by rivalries and jealousy, but the promise continues to be fulfilled. The children who will form the 12 tribes of Israel are being born, one by one. Over time, Jacob prospers, but he knows he can't run away forever. The time has come to return, and along with that comes the fear of meeting Esau again. On the eve of the meeting, Jacob makes an unusual decision. He separates from his family, crosses the river, and remains alone. It is in this solitude that something supernatural happens. In the darkness of night, a man appears and fights with him until dawn. There are no clear words, no explanations, only the struggle. Bodies move, sweat drips, tension builds. But Jacob does not back down. When the man sees that he cannot defeat him, he touches his thigh and dislocates it. Still, Jacob clings to it. And he says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So, the question is asked, what is your name? Jacob. Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and have overcome. The man leaves. The sun rises. Jacob, limping, now bears a visible mark and a new name. He is no longer the one who deceives. That's what he's fighting for, and it survives. The one who was running away now faces the consequences. He lied before, now he confesses. What he used to take with cunning, he now receives with faith. Israel was born there, not yet as a nation, but as an identity. The name carried pain, but also transformation. And it was in this name that God built the foundation of an entire people. The man who woke up limping was no longer Jacob. He was Israel. And that new name wasn't just a title. It was a milestone, a reminder that God transforms, renames, and redirects the destiny of those who wrestle with him and no longer run away. But Israel would not be an isolated man. The plan was bigger, because a nation is not born from one person alone. It is born from many. And from Israel, many others began to emerge. Jacob had 12 sons. They did not all come from a single woman, nor were they born in an atmosphere of peace. They were the result of rivalry, frustration, jealousy, and disputes between 4 women: Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah. Each birth carried tension and significance. Each name, a story. Leah, despised but fertile, gave birth to the firstborn: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Rachel, who had been barren for a time, watched from a distance. In her distress, she gave her servant Bilhah to Jacob, who bore Dan and Naphtali. Leah responded by offering Zilpah, who had Gad and Asher. Later, Leah had 2 more children, Issachar and Zebulun. Finally, Rachel conceived. Joseph was born, and years later, Benjamin. 12 children, 12 men with different personalities, 12 seeds that would give rise to the tribes of Israel. But for now, they were just children, brothers living together, but without true unity. And the central point of tension soon became evident: Jose, Jacob's favorite son, son of the beloved woman, child of old age. And that's why he's surrounded by privileges. Jacob gives him a special tunic, a visible symbol of distinction. But what really ignites the conflict are the dreams. Joseph begins to recount visions in which his brothers bow down before him, and these words become unbearable for hearts already inflamed. Jealousy grows, anger festers, and then, in the field, the plan is executed. They throw him into a well. They are thinking of killing him, but they sell him as a slave. Jose, some know horizon, and for Jacob, death. A blood-stained tunic is all that remains. Grief descends upon him, and the family falls into silence. But even when far away, God is not absent. Joseph, now in Egypt, endures the humiliation of slavery, slander, and imprisonment. But at each step of the abyss, something invisible supported him, until, in due time, he is exalted, from prisoner to governor, from forgotten to savior, because the world would descend into famine. And Egypt, because of Joseph's wisdom, I would have bread. And it is this bread that brings his brothers back. They don't recognize him, but he sees them, he tests them, he observes them. I want to know if they're still the same, if envy still prevails, if the hatred still burns. The answer comes with tears. Judah, the same man who had sold him, now offers himself as a slave in place of his younger brother. Jose can't take it anymore. Cry, reveal yourself, and the reconciliation explodes with emotion. Israel hears that his son is alive, and he leaves for Egypt with his whole family. 70 people in total, 70 souls crossing the desert, descending to a strange land, but with renewed hope. There, they are received with honor. Goshen, a fertile region, is given to them, and there they grow, they multiply. From family, they became a clan. From clan, they became a people. Jacob, now old, sees his grandchildren. Bless each child. Every blessing contains destiny, prophecy, correction, and promise. The most extensive blessing is for Judah. The scepter will come from him. The lion will come out of it. From his lineage will be born the eternal king. Joseph, in turn, receives a special honor. His 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, are adopted as tribes by Jacob. This allows for 2 tribes to exist in its place, even without a tribe of Joseph, and for the count of 12 to continue, even with Levi set apart for the priesthood in the future. Time passes. Jacob dies. Joseph buries him in the promised land, with honors. Then, Joseph also dies, and a new chapter begins. But before that, something fundamental had already happened. Israel was now a people, with identity, memories, honor, and bonds. Even far from the promised land, the promise accompanied them. They were no longer just the sons of a patriarch. They were a collective body, organized by tribes, connected by blood and faith. The number 12 now carried weight. It was structure, it was a symbol, and it was Plano. Each tribe with its role, its future territory, its vocation. Even amidst failures and setbacks, the covenant with God remained alive. Israel did not yet have a throne, a temple, or a law, but they already existed as a people. The seed planted with Abraham, germinated with Isaac, and named with Jacob. Now it was growing, and it was preparing to bloom. In Egypt, they would be protected for a while, but not forever. because before they could enter the land, they would have to pass through the fire, and in the desert, they would be forged not only as a people, but as a nation. It's impossible to imagine this family, full of flaws, jealousy, and reconciliation, becoming the foundation of an entire nation, and not ask yourself, which part of this story affected me the most? Was it a reunion between Joseph and his brothers? Unexpected forgiveness? Jacob's prophetic blessing upon his children? Comment below. Which moment in this journey touched your heart the most? Or what did God remind you of while you were watching? And if this story is inspiring you, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss the next chapters. Because when we share what God is saying, the promise reaches even further. From the beginning, the history of Israel has carried a weight that no other nation on earth has ever carried. It is not the weight of war, nor of culture, nor of politics. It's the weight of a choice. Israel was not born by force. It was born from a promise, and that promise separated them. He called him to a specific, eternal, and often misunderstood purpose. But what does it actually mean to be chosen by God? To understand this, it is necessary to go back to the exact moment when this word first appears in relation to Israel, and observe not only what was said, but in what context it was said. Moses, already in the desert, before a people recently freed from Egypt, declares, "For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession, be out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth." Deuteronomy 7:6. This choice was not based on merit. It wasn't because the people were numerous, strong, or just. On the contrary, God himself explains, "The Lord loved you, because the Lord wanted to keep the oath he swore to your ancestors." Deuteronomy 7:8. The point is clear. Israel was chosen out of love and covenant, not out of superiority. The idea of a chosen nation has no relation to earthly privilege. It's related to mission. To be chosen by God is to be set apart for a specific purpose, to reveal God to the world. From the covenant with Abraham, this was the plan. Through him and his descendants, all the families of the earth would be blessed. This required a different kind of people, that it would not conform to the patterns of the surrounding nations, that he might walk according to holy laws, that he might live justly, that he might carry a light in the midst of darkness. Being chosen didn't mean being above others. It meant being of service. At Mount Sinai, this identity was confirmed with direct words. "If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Exodus 19:5-6. The promise was now taking shape. Israel would not merely be a people with a land. It would be a bridge between God and the nations, a living example of the divine will, a showcase of God's character before the world. But with that calling also came responsibility. The Torah, the law given to Moses, was not a burden imposed on the people. It was an invitation to holiness, a manual for living in covenant with the eternal. She taught social justice, respect, purity, compassion, and honor. Every law, every commandment, every statute, it was part of a structure that would transform former slaves into a people with their own identity, with deep roots, with a collective calling. And even when Israel failed, and it failed many times, God remained faithful to his choice, not because of their merit, but because of his name. Divine choice has never been fragile. She was and continues to be steadfast, even in the face of rebellion. The prophets understood this. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, they all confronted Israel forcefully, but they never said that the choice had been cancelled. On the contrary, God's love for his people is described as an eternal, patient, redeeming love. "I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore I have drawn you with loving kindness." Jeremiah 31:3. In the book of Amos, God makes a statement that summarizes the essence of choice. "Of all the families of the earth, I have known only you. Therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities." Amos 3:2. In other words, being chosen doesn't mean escaping discipline. It's precisely about being called upon to meet a higher standard. Throughout the centuries, Israel would be persecuted, scattered, exiled, but never forgotten, because the alliance made with the patriarchs was stronger than time, deeper than mistakes, firmer than disobedience. This choice also pointed to something bigger, a specific descendant, a promise within a promise, the Messiah. From Genesis onwards, the text builds this thread, from the seed of the woman, through Abraham, Judah, David, until reaching the one who would be a light to the Gentiles and the glory of Israel. Jesus was born within that choice, not outside of it. He is the fulfillment of all that was promised, and he himself said, "Salvation comes from the Jews." John 4:22. This does not mean that all Jews accepted the message, but it means that God used Israel as a channel to reach the world, and he continues to use it. The Apostle Paul speaks clearly about this in Romans. He says that God's gifts and calling are irrevocable, and that Israel, even when stumbling, still has a role in the eternal plan. Therefore, the term chosen nation remains relevant, not as ethnic superiority, but as a spiritual designation. Israel was called to reveal God, to preserve the revelation, to keep the wedding ring safe, to bring the word, and to be a sign among the nations, and even during periods of silence, persecution, or dispersal, the promise remains alive. Throughout history, many have tried to erase these people, but God's choice cannot be undone by human decrees. She is eternal. Today, Israel's existence remains a visible reminder that God fulfills his words, and that his faithfulness overcomes the impossible. To be chosen is to carry a mission. It's about enduring trials. It's about living beyond oneself. And that is why the history of Israel is not just an ancient history. It's a vivid response. God's choice of a people reveals something greater, his plan of redemption for all of humanity. 4,000 years have passed since that first calling. In the midst of a foreign land, where the voices of idols multiplied and the sky seemed distant, a man heard something that would forever change the course of humanity. He didn't know where he was going. He had no maps, no allies. But he took the first step, and with it began a lineage that would traverse empires, deserts, exiles, and promises. Abraham heard and believed. Isaac was born against all logic. Jacob was transformed into Israel. And from his children, a living, strong, imperfect structure was born, but one that carries an eternal calling. Israel did not emerge like other nations. It was not created through conquest or war, but through faith and obedience. Its origin is rooted in something deeper than territory. It is embedded in a covenant made with God. This alliance, from the beginning, was more than just a political or cultural agreement. It involved a plan, a purpose that did not end with them. Because the promise made to Abraham didn't just say, "I will make you into a great nation," but also, "In you all the families of the earth will be blessed." This phrase reveals the key to everything. Israel was set apart to become an instrument, a channel between heaven and earth. His mission was to carry the light of the one true God into a world surrounded by darkness, idolatry, and injustice. Carry the word, preserve the commandments, and to keep alive the hope of a Redeemer who was to come. It wasn't an easy path. The people have not always responded with loyalty. There were falls, murmurings, betrayals, idolatry, but the promise held. Because she did not depend on the perfection of the people, but of God's faithfulness. The Bible clearly shows that even when Israel turned away, God did not abandon them. Even when the prophetic voice fell silent, the covenant remained intact. And even when the temple fell, the people were scattered, and silence reigned over the land. The seed remained alive. This story isn't about merit. It's about a calling. Being chosen has never meant being exempt from pain. On the contrary, it meant burden, mission, responsibility. It meant bearing the weight of divine revelation and often going against the current of the world. Israel faced Egypt, Babylon, and Rome. He was enslaved, exiled, and persecuted, but it remained. And this is no accident. It's on purpose. Because the history of Israel points to something greater than itself. It points to a promise that began with a man, but that would end on the cross. Jesus, the promised Messiah, was born into this lineage. He is the embodiment of the alliance, the fulfillment of the word, living proof that God does not lie. Salvation came through Israel. The word was preserved through Israel, and the hope of the world was revealed through this nation. But the story doesn't end there. Because even after the coming of the Messiah, Israel's role continues. The Apostle Paul states that God's gifts and calling are irrevocable. Israel continues to be a sign. It remains a living reminder that God chooses, protects, disciplines, restores, and fulfills. When we look at Israel today, we are looking at something more than geopolitics. We are looking at the living memory of an ancient alliance and the harbinger of all that is yet to come. Because the Bible also points to a future where that nation will once again recognize its Redeemer, where eyes will be opened, where faith will be restored, and where the promise will shine again in full force. Until then, the question that keeps echoing isn't just about Israel. It's also about us. Because if God was faithful to the covenant made millennia ago with a man alone in the desert, so he is also faithful to what he promises today. If he protected this people amidst persecution, wars, and dispersal, so it also protects us in the midst of our storms. God's faithfulness to the history of Israel is the greatest proof that he does not give up on what he begins. And if that story still resonates, it's because the God of promise is still writing chapters. Israel was born as a promise. It became a people. It was shaped as a nation. And to this day it bears the mark of the eternal calling. May this story strengthen your faith. May she remind you that the word of God never fails, and that even when all seems lost, his covenant remains firm. Because he who called Abraham, that sustained Isaac, that transformed Jacob, and that gave shape to the people in the desert, it is the same one that continues to call, save, and fulfill today. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of this, and may God's faithfulness to Israel renew their hope. Because if he fulfilled what he promised 4,000 years ago, he will also fulfill what he promised you.